interview. Today, I'm sitting down with Mr. Ingram, Jonathan Ingram. He is the author of books such as Crash, as well as one of his latest releases, Winning in Reverse, Bill Lester's book. John, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing fine. The sun is shining and we're talking about racing and books.
That's always a perfect day for me. I guess we'll go ahead and jumping into it. Jonathan, what came first for you, a love of riding or for motorsports?
Brandon, I appreciate you asking that because the usual assumption is that you're involved in racing because you really just, as a professional and on a regular basis, because you really just can't get enough racing. And while that may be true, my original connection was as a sports writer and assigned to cover races. In other words, I was not a fan before I was assigned to cover races. I was familiar with it. I went to some of the local races, the Beltsville Speedway, asphalt short track near where I grew up in Arlington, Virginia. But it wasn't until I was assigned by the Durham Morning Herald to go to the Southern 500 in 1976, where David Pearson clinched the Triple Crown and the Wood Brothers Mercury, that I really thought, this would be something great to write about. So the first goal was to figure out a way to make a living as a writer. And then it became figuring out how to make a living as a writer in motor racing. And at the time I started, 70s, 1980s, the mainstream press hadn't caught up with racing really, except on a couple big days of the year. So, what was called the World 600 and the Indy 500, Monaco and so forth. But so there were a lot of specialty publications, which we all know. And so that created a path for me to begin to write about motor racing. And then as it grew in popularity, the mainstream media started getting a lot more interested. And in 1991, which would be 15 years after I started, my first NASCAR race, I was hired to cover racing by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And then I had the best of both worlds, which was writing for mainstream publications like Sports Illustrated or the car magazines like Motor Trend, and also for Dick Berggren's Stock Car Racing, as well as the local newspapers. So, I was kind of in the right place at the right time. I like to think that I believed that racing was going to grow in popularity, and that's turned out to be the case. So I was fortunate. I guess I stayed with it because of my love of racing.
Like I said, one of your most recent books was Winning in Reverse. What is typically the process behind a book such as that? Is it, for you, is it as an author reaching out to someone you find, very fascinating? Is it them reaching out to authors and saying, here's my story, do you want to help me? What's kind of that process like?
It can be a variety of factors, but I do enjoy talking about the process because to me, I think that's an interesting background to how these books appear and why. So with some of the books I do, I pitch the idea to do the book, and I recruit the subject, let's say. So I did one on Bob Riley, who was a great designer and still working in his office daily to this day in his mid-80s. And, he drove the car for that A.J. Foyt won his fourth Indy 500 in, and he helped engineer the car that Dale Earnhardt drove to victory in the Daytona 500 in 1998. So,
oh, wow.
Bob's an interesting guy. So I reached out to Bob and said, I think you've done so much in so many different types of racing. What do you think about doing a book? And then he thought it was a good idea, and then we landed a publisher. In the case of Bill Lester, Bill was looking at doing a public speaking career, and which is where he's at right now. And in terms of once we start gathering in public again, he's going to try to move down that road. So the timing was that his sons were getting into junior high and high school, so he could pay closer attention to doing something with his career once again. So the folks who are involved in public speaking say, you know, you really should have a book whenever you go out to speak in public for people to follow up on what you're talking about. And so, and it's a good way to engage people into a book. It's not always easy to sell books. And so Bill called me, and he thought, you know, he was thinking, well, maybe I'd recommend a brother, you know, so someone, an African-American writer who I knew that would be interested in his story. And of course, I mean, he reached out to me because we both live in Atlanta. And when he was racing trucks, I was covering the series for various publications. And in fact, when he moved up to the Cup in Atlanta in 2006, I covered that weekend for the New York Times. So, yeah, and we would occasionally do lunch. We had a friend in common, his agent, Artie Arani. I don't enjoy going to tracks on test days. It's pretty boring. It's a lot of standing around doing not much if you're not driving the car, and even if you are. So, you know, I got to know Bill fairly well. And that's why he reached out to me. Also, Bill is great at networking and maintaining a network of friends. So I immediately jumped at the opportunity and said, you know, Bill, we need to have a cup of coffee and sit down and talk about this, because I'd like to write your story. So that's how it started. We met over coffee several times to get to know one another better than just in the garage. And for me to tell Bill why I was so interested in his story, and to suggest that we could, you know, have a successful book. So that's how we got started. And, you know, I feel more comfortable presenting a book to a publisher that's really in a mature form. You have, you know, it takes a proposal to a publisher. And I like the idea of having a chapter from the beginning, a middle, and the end to present to a publisher to give them an idea of what it's about. They don't want to read them unless you have a good idea. So, but once they do get there and think, oh yeah, this could be something we'd be interested in. So that's my methodology. That's what worked with Bob Riley. That's what worked with Crash, my book that I did with Jim Downing, a longtime sports car racer, and Bob Hubbard, the designer of the Hans device. So that, you know, I'm on a roll. Let's say I've done 3 books that have come out since 2017, and all of them have worked by that process. I'm sort of, in a way, giving away how I, you know, get things done. But, you know, I think that I'm good enough at it that another idea, I can, if I come up with another idea, I can make the same method work, and more power to anybody else who wants to do a book.
That's awesome. For most authors, choosing a favorite book of theirs is like having to choose a favorite kid. But for you, do you have a project or two that stands out to you that you just, you learned a lot, you just were fascinated by it, you feel like it helped people? Just, is there a project or two you see as like, this was my favorite?
Okay. You know, now I see why you're in this business. So that is yet another engaging question. I would think for a lot of readers or race fans, and also for myself as an author or anybody that's a potential author. So I don't know that I would see a book as being kind of like a child, and then you end up with, you know, 8 or 10 children. But I'm currently working on pitching the 9th book. But I think that if it's a nonfiction book, if the author, and I do all my own research, I don't, you know, there's some New York Times best-selling authors that rely on researchers, and more power to them if that methodology works. And I've yet to make the New York Times bestseller list, but I think if you stacked put all my books end to end, they would add up to one to making the bestseller list, but that would have to be all eight of them. So I do all my own research. I also do all my own transcripts when I interview people, and I sit down and I just like we're doing and record it. But then I write out the transcript and then I send it back. Let's talk, since we're talking about Bill Lester, he and I would meet 2 days a week, and Tuesdays and Thursdays, and by the end of Wednesday, I'd have the transcript from Tuesday. And then by the next Monday, I'd have the transcript from Thursday. And so I think it's important to be directly engaged, and it spawns questions to do the transcripts. You cannot rewrite the conversation without you think of things you might not have asked or you should be alert to. So that's one research method. The other, of course, is to get into racing publications if you're doing a racing story and follow up on the history. But that's all a roundabout way of saying that if the writer isn't fascinated by what he's learning, and also pushing the envelope to learn more, then it seems to me that it would be hard to translate that into a book that people want to keep reading the next page. In other words, the learning process is part of the enthusiasm and energy behind a book. You know, this is what I learned. The light bulb went off, and wow, that's really cool. And how do I, you know, translate that into this particular chapter that I'm working on? So I think that's the key thing. And I would say the Bob Riley book is titled The Art of Race Car Design. Then Crash came, subtitled From Senna to Earnhardt, How the Hans Helped Save Racing, pretty much about the safety revolution. And that arrived in the 90s, and then after Dale Earnhardt was killed. And then the Bill Lester book, I would say they all involved a lot of research that I enjoyed doing. So I think those three books, I think they would stand out to any 3 consecutive books that any racing writer has done. So I'm pretty proud of them, obviously. But to me, it's the research and then the carrying that research into the book and hearing people say, "Oh man, I didn't know that before." You know, keep reading; you'll find a lot of stuff that you haven't known previously. So there you have it.
So now with Crash, was that something that is that something that you were aware of, kind of the back and forth with safety in the 90s and all, or is that something that you really got interested in, you know, post Earnhardt's death and when that conversation really started cranking up?
Yeah, once again, you've kind of nailed the process. As the writer for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where I started in 1991, I believe in 92, I wrote an article about Jim Downing and the Hans device, and was the first to write about it in the major media. But I've been covering Jim and IMSA for over a decade, or almost just about a decade at that point. So I knew Jim, and Jim, of course, let me know about what he was doing with the Hans device. But very importantly, I was friends and worked with Butch Lindley, one of the all-time great short track drivers, an all-pro champion, a 2-time NASCAR late model sportsman champion, and just one of the most successful short track drivers of the late 70s and early 1980s. And you know, Butch, of course, suffered a crash, an injury in a crash in Bradenton, Florida. The DeSoto Speedway is what it was called at the time, I believe. And, you know, ended up in the hospital in a coma with a head injury. So that was personally very challenging for me. And I stayed in touch with his wife, and his son, Marty, of course, eventually went racing. And so that was a tough one. And then Gene Felton, another driver I knew well from here in Atlanta, broke his neck at Riverside in a crash in a Trans Am race shortly thereafter. So that was in the early 80s. So I was asking myself the same question that Jim Downing asked. You know, what is it with these head injuries?
Yeah.
And fortunately, Jim Downing, you know, asked that question and then pursued it. with his brother-in-law, Bob Hubbard, a biomechanical engineer, in no small part because Jim was behind the wheel of a race car on a regular basis and didn't want to suffer a head injury himself. And he was noticing how often they were occurring. Another one that would come to mind would be J.D. McDuffie in the early 90s at Watkins Glen. So when that sort of thing happened, I would talk with Jerry Petty, the physician in Charlotte, who's a neurosurgeon, who's got interested in head restraints and head injuries, of course. And I think at one point he operated on Buddy Baker for a subdural hematoma, something along those lines. And so I was following up constantly on head injuries throughout the 90s. And the key thing as far as the book goes, and certainly I was at the Daytona 500 when Dale got killed. I wrote 2 books on Dale. I'm one of the few that's written 3 if you include Crash, because there's a lot about Dale in there, and the circumstances of the crash, but also Dale himself. So Jim Downing hired me in 2010 to help him work on public relations at his company. So one of the good things about being a freelance writer is you can be flexible. Yeah. And I never filed stories on the subject of safety or the Hans device because it's a conflict of interest. But I thought it was okay to work there and continue to write about racing in the usual ways. So, and I let my editors know. But, one day I was there in the office and Gary Milgram, who ran the company for Jim, he talked about how the Hans device transfers the energy from the forehead, where the helmet tends to go forward and catch in a crash where there's a frontal impact, and how it transferred the energy through the tethers and to the carbon collar. And I was there and I was working, doing, I think, a pretty good job on public relations for the Hans device. And I'd been writing about it for 20 years. And for the first time, I realized how it worked. I didn't, I was like a lot of people, I thought, oh, it just restrains the head. It just holds the head back. Well, yes, it does. But the key element is that the energy is transferred. So it doesn't just hold it. That wouldn't work. It transfers the energy through the tethers, through the collar, into the torso. So that's when the light bulb went off. I said, for a guy who's followed this head injuries and the Hans device all these years, and I didn't know that, there's probably a lot of things that would be of interest, not only on the technical side, but also following up on what happened in the aftermath of Senna's crash, because I was there reporting on what happened, in the 6 months after Dale Earnhardt's crash. But also I thought that the passage of time would give me a chance to talk to people, behind the scenes, get behind the scenes, go back and do the history of what was going on. So that was all, the light bulb went off, in that way.
As you said, your books have focused on everything from the Hans device to Bill Lester to Dale Earnhardt. Do you have a dream topic or series within motorsports that you would like to write about one day? I know you said you have book number 9 coming, but is there a topic out there that still is on that dream list?
Well, dreaming does bring up another dimension. So I would say the 9th book is a nonfiction book. And so let's just kind of leave it at that, and we'll see how it goes. It's easy to talk about books, I learned the hard way, and a lot more challenging to actually write them, but above all, land a publisher. So let's just say the 9th book is a nonfiction book. The proposed 9th book, until you get a publisher and write it, you don't have one. So, but when you say dream, that's an interesting word. So, there's always that idea of a great American racing novel. So a fiction account that incorporates racing in a way that's engaging for people who don't know anything about racing and for people who have followed it all their lives and are, closely acquainted with it.
Mm-hmm.
So the real challenge there is that the general rule of thumb, as far as I'm concerned, is that people who follow racing or don't care about fiction, because the real thing is pretty darn, interesting and extraordinary, and who would have thunk it kind of deal. But I mean, Brian Redmond used to say racing is like a crucible of life. I mean, you see everything about human beings at a racetrack and in a motor race. So, and in the racing profession. So, there's that challenge and that the sport itself is so interesting. Why create fiction? And then there's a reason why people don't know anything about racing or don't follow it, who might also be the same people who read a lot of fiction, because they're not interested. So that's the real challenge, to try to get around both those issues of non-racing fans not being interested in fictional accounts and racing fans not being interested in fictional accounts, each for their own reasons. So I don't want to get too close to what the initial beginning I have on that, but you would probably, this is a tried and true fictional method. You may want to start with a true to life character, and then go from there. So I'll throw out three that come to my mind just as I say that. Bill France Sr., who I knew Bill Jr. a lot better. We had our times together, let's say, and but I didn't know Big Bill, and Junior Johnson. On my blog, I think I have a definitive story on Junior outside of Tom Wolfe's great Last American Hero, which of course, reading that is part of why I got so interested in racing. And the other, of course, would be Dale Earnhardt.
Yeah.
So, that is a technique to take a character that's already exists and go from there and put him in a new and different setting, or try to shed light on the behind the scenes story and the motivations and the personality. So that's my dream, but I'm pretty busy, so I'm not sure how that's going to go.
Like you said, there's tons of people that sit there and say, well, why would you write a fiction book when you can write a book about this person or that person or this race that happened? And I know that for a lot of people it's kind of controversial and they don't seem in the best light, but I personally know so many people that would have never showed up at a race or sat down for 5 hours to watch a race on Sunday, but they went and watched Cars or Talladega Nights or Days of Thunder, and that got them thinking, and friends asking, is that how the sport is? Or they would go to a race and they would say, oh, I see where they kind of made that joke about this person. And, for me, I sit there and I think, I love a good autobiography or documentary, but I also know for a ton of people, they're now going to racing because they watch something as silly as Talladega Nights,
Right. Yeah, I think that Robert Towns, the screenwriter for Days of Thunder, basically sat down with Rick Hendrick and Harry Hyde, and they swapped a lot of stories, and that's where the screenplay by Robert Towns came from, who I think I'm correct, wrote Chinatown, one heck of a piece of film history and fiction. So Days of Thunder was kind of based on conversation with Rick Hendrick and Harry Hyde, and possibly some others. So that works. That methodology works. As far as you mentioned Talladega Nights, I get a kick out of it every time I watch it. I think it's just fabulous, and it's one step removed with a creative comic genius, applying his touch, and those are those are out there, and they work, and they do, I think, get people more engaged in the sport. So yeah, I don't want, never say never is something I
Hmm.
learned in motor racing. That saying from one of those multimillionaire sports car guys in
Hmm.
IMSA who was racing a Porsche 962. He was the first guy said that wrote a story about building a car and never saying never.
Hmm.
Uh, it was a modification of a Porsche 935. So, you know, that sticks with me. So yeah, never say never about that. As you mentioned, the challenge that can be the hurdle that you can overcome about doing fiction that engages a lot of different
Hmm.
people, not only racers, but people of a non-racing background.
And finally, when I was researching, I noticed that you were a contributor for the Beer Connoisseur. Um, what makes a good beer and what makes a great beer? What's the difference between that?
Uh, yeah, you're very good on the research side, and so that's one of the other things I do is write about beer, and I'm not sure how qualified I am to answer that question. But
Hmm.
off the top of my head, I would say that I went to work for a brewery called Scofflaw Brewing, 2 miles from my house, after I left the Beer Connoisseur,
Hmm.
and I was their first in-house PR guy when they opened, and I took that job because the owner took me back to the tap by the cooler, not just the tap at the front of at the bar, but he took me
Uh-huh.
all the way back and said, okay, you're a beer writer. Let's go back here. I'll give you special treatment, that kind of thing. So, he poured a half a glass and, at that time, unfiltered beer was just coming into vogue, which would have been 2016. So I held it up and said, oh yeah, unfiltered. That's cool. And it was an IPA. And of course they were really coming on strong at that time. I drank it and said, yeah, that's really good. So he figured I must know what I was talking about. And so we stopped on the way back up to the bar at one of the bright tanks, which is where the beer rests for a couple days
Hmm.
prior to being kegged or canned. And so everything settles out and it gets nice and bright. So he poured me a half glass right from the tank, and it was the first batch they'd made of a beer called Hooligan. And I looked him in the eye and I said, that's a beautiful beer. And so I suppose I should ask myself out loud. The first one he gave me was called Basement, and it's really good. And obviously, I have close association with the brewery, so people
Hmm.
can take all this with a grain of salt if they like. But the first one, it had uh, an interesting, to me, a great beer has an interesting structure. That is how it goes from the aroma to the initial taste to the mouth feel and to the final swallow, which incorporates all your tongue, but also the nose from the back of the throat,
Hmm.
which is where the flavor is. So to me, I think a great beer has a great taste and aroma and appearance, uh, and in my personal opinion, has an arpeggio of flavor. In other
Hmm.
words, it smoothly goes from that aroma to the initial sip to the mouthfeel to the final swallow in a way that kind of is a journey.
Uh-huh.
It's you don't stop at each floor and go ding. Okay, there are the hops. Ding, there's the malt. Uh, ding. There,
Hmm.
there's lingerie. Ding. There's, it's not like riding an elevator where you stop at each floor. It
Hmm.
has an arpeggio of flavor, and both of those beers, the Hooligan and Basement, I guess I'm walking myself through this why I like them so much. Um, but there are a lot of great ones out there. A classic would be Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, for example, which created the craft brewing movement and came out in 1981 and is still going strong. So I guess I'm glad you asked. There are a lot of great beers out there.
Awesome. Well, Jonathan, thanks for joining us today. For the listeners at home, where can they find you and your books at online?
My favorite question. And as they say, that's a really good question. So I'm I'm going to hold up Crash because I happen to have this copy handy. But you can find all the books and the thumbnails and more information at www.jingrambooks.com, JINGRAM books.com. So that's been up a while, but yeah, you can get a lot more information right there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Brandon, it's been a pleasure.